In October of 1996, something happened on Black Hollow Road that no one in town could explain. Because the next morning, when a neighbor drove past Margaret Hale's orchard, her kitchen light was still on, her radio was still playing, and her front door was standing open. But Margaret was gone. Margaret Hale was 67 years old, and she had lived alone at the end of that dirt road for nearly 4 decades. The orchard had belonged to her family long before that. Rows of old apple trees stretched behind her house, their branches low and heavy, even in good weather. Margaret liked isolation, or at least she tolerated it better than most. After her husband died in a logging accident 16 years earlier, she withdrew almost completely. Trips into town were brief, cash only. No small talk. People described her as private. What they meant was distant. 3 days before she disappeared, Margaret hired a seasonal worker named Noah Briggs to help with the harvest. He was 24, from 2 towns over, soft-spoken, eager, too eager. Some would later say there was also an ongoing dispute with a former tenant who claimed Margaret owed him money for unfinished repairs. The argument had escalated from letters to tense phone calls before abruptly stopping. Then came October 14th. That night, a thin fog rolled down from the hills and settled low over the orchard. Around 9:30 p.m., Margaret's nearest neighbor, Elaine Porter, noticed headlights moving slowly along Black Hollow Road. That part wasn't strange. What was strange was how long they lingered. Elaine watched from her kitchen window as the lights turned down Margaret's half-mile driveway. She never saw them come back out. Inside Margaret's house, the kitchen light burned past midnight. A small radio played softly on the counter. A kettle sat on the stove. On the table was a single teacup, half full. The next morning, the fog still clung to the trees. Elaine drove down the dirt road around 10, planning to ask about buying apples before the frost ruined them. Margaret's truck was parked beside the barn. The front door wasn't locked. The radio was still playing. The tea was cold. There were no broken windows, no overturned chairs, no signs of a struggle, just a quiet house and an orchard heavy with fruit. Waiting. And the only question anyone could answer with certainty was this. A car had gone down that driveway the night before, but no one ever saw it leave. When deputies first arrived at the orchard, they didn't treat it like a crime scene. There was no broken glass, no forced entry, no blood, just an older woman who wasn't where she was supposed to be. At first, they suggested the obvious. Maybe Margaret wandered off. Maybe she fell somewhere in the orchard. Maybe confusion had set in. But that theory didn't last long. Margaret didn't go anywhere without her coat. It was still hanging by the door. Her boots were lined neatly beneath it. Her purse sat on the counter, cash envelope untouched. If she had walked out voluntarily, she hadn't planned to. The first person detectives interviewed was Noah Briggs, the seasonal worker. He said he left around 5 p.m. the evening before. Margaret had paid him in cash. They talked briefly about the coming frost. Nothing unusual. When asked about the headlights seen later that night, Noah paused. Just for a second. Then he said he had no idea who that could have been. He didn't own a car, he explained. He borrowed his cousin's truck for work. The truck had been returned before dark. Detectives wrote that down. Next was Calvin Moore, the former tenant. His dispute with Margaret had grown tense over the summer. He claimed she owed him money for repairs to the barn. Margaret insisted he never finished the job. Calvin told investigators he hadn't been near the orchard in weeks. He was tired of fighting, he said. He wanted to move on. When asked if he had driven down Black Hollow Road on October 14th, he answered immediately. No. No hesitation. Then there was Elaine Porter. Elaine was certain about one thing. The vehicle had turned into Margaret's driveway, and it had stayed there, long enough to notice, not long enough to feel normal. Behind the barn, near the tool shed, investigators found faint tire impressions in the damp soil, partially blurred by morning moisture. They didn't match Margaret's track. The pattern wasn't complete, but one detail stood out. The vehicle had reversed near the shed, as if adjusting position, or preparing to leave carefully. There were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, just quiet trees, and apples beginning to fall. By the end of that week, the orchard was no longer treated as a simple welfare check. It was treated as a disappearance, and investigators began asking a different question. Not whether Margaret had walked away, but who she would have opened the door for. For weeks, nothing obvious surfaced. No ransom calls, no sightings, no financial activity. Margaret's bank account remained untouched. Her mail piled up in a neat stack by the door. The orchard began to rot quietly under early frost. Search teams combed the woods surrounding Black Hollow Road. They walked grid patterns through brush and creek beds. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. If Margaret had fallen nearby, she would have been found, which meant one of two things. She left with someone, or someone made sure she wouldn't be. Detectives returned to the house and started over, this time slower. They photographed everything, measured distances, opened drawers that had already been opened. In the kitchen, they noticed something small. The chair at the table, the one facing the teacup, was slightly pulled back. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest someone had stood up quickly. Across from it, the second chair was pushed in, perfectly aligned, as if someone had taken care to leave it that way. In the sink, there was only one cup, one spoon, one plate. Margaret hadn't set the table for company, but someone had been there long enough for her to make tea. Behind the house, near the tool shed where the tire impressions were found, investigators discovered something else. A shallow indentation in the grass, roughly rectangular, about the size of a large storage trunk. The grass beneath it was flattened deeper than the surrounding ground, as if weight had rested there briefly. It hadn't been noticed during the first search, because it didn't look dramatic. It looked ordinary. Inside the shed, tools were neatly hung. Nothing appeared missing. But on a lower shelf, detectives found a roll of plastic sheeting, partially unspooled. Margaret had no recent receipts for it. When questioned again, Noah insisted he had never used plastic on the property. Calvin said the same. Both men agreed on one thing. Margaret was cautious. She didn't open her door after dark, which led investigators to a troubling conclusion. If someone entered that house willingly, Margaret must have known them, because the house showed no signs of force. No broken locks, no splintered wood, just a kettle gone cold, a radio playing to an empty room, and a driveway that held the faint memory of tires that had come in and left. Winter came early to Black Hollow Road. Snow settled between the rows of apple trees, covering fallen fruit and softening the earth where tire impressions had once been visible. Whatever the ground had tried to say was gone now, but the case didn't disappear with the weather. Detectives re-examined the plastic sheeting found in the shed. It was sold at only one hardware store within 20 miles. Store records from the previous month showed a cash purchase matching the roll's brand and size. The buyer couldn't be identified, but the timing narrowed things. 3 days before Margaret vanished, phone records revealed something else. On the afternoon of October 14th, Margaret had received a call that lasted just under 2 minutes, from a payphone, located less than 5 miles away. Security footage from a nearby gas station, time-stamped minutes before that call, showed a familiar truck pulling into frame. It belonged to Noah Briggs' cousin. When confronted again, Noah admitted he had driven past the orchard later that night. He said he only wanted to talk. Margaret had mentioned letting him go after harvest, He panicked. Work was scarce. He needed the money. He insisted she invited him in. They sat at the kitchen table. She made tea. He said they argued. Quiet at first, then not. He claimed she told him to leave. What happened next, he described as a mistake. Not planned. Not thought through. Just anger that went too far. He said she fell. That he didn't mean for it to happen. But investigators didn't believe it was that simple. Because after she fell, Noah didn't call for help. Instead, he carried her to the shed, wrapped her, loaded her into the borrowed truck, and drove. He led authorities to a wooded ravine nearly 40 miles north. Margaret's remains were found before the first heavy snowfall sealed the ground. At trial, Noah maintained it was an accident. The jury disagreed. Years later, the orchard was sold, the house repainted, the trees trimmed back. But locals still say that if you drive down Black Hollow Road at night, the place feels paused, like someone stood up from a table and never quite finished their tea.